Tsepiso Makkwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
Okay, so let's reflect now on the SADC meeting of leaders in Antananarivo, where the call was made by Botswana's President Duma on greater regional integration, particularly between SADC. We're joined now by President of the Economics Association of Malawi, Dr. Bertha Bangara-Chikadza. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Dr. Chikadza, are you with us?
Good evening. Yes.
Okay, so what...
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you, ma'am. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just first start with the call that's made by SADC leaders. It's obviously on the back of similar calls that have been made over the past couple of weeks, months, especially against this backdrop of growing economic trade tensions geopolitically, and with, in particular, the United States has changed the playing field. What should they be talking about now beyond this refrain?
Because what has started, especially from the speech by President Duma, is just striking at the heart of Africa's economic vulnerability. Africa has untapped potential. It has huge resources, but it is also at the mercy of the developed countries in such a way that any mood swings tend to affect the economies very high. And we've seen the vulnerabilities now, especially with the tariffs, where countries are actually losing a lot of trade because of these tariffs. And actually, we are seeing that this is resonating with the African Continental Free Trade Area, where I think we are talking about deepening trade between African countries. But apart from just talking, I think countries should now be looking forward, moving above the talks and start implementing, because we've been in these comfort zones for a long time, but now we need to implement. We need to have the infrastructure that should actually connect the countries. We need to have better roads, a rail that can move goods and trade from one country to another. We need even to boost the connections when we're talking about maybe moving goods. Apart from just moving goods, we are talking about e-commerce, e-trade. We need things like those. So the infrastructure is quite important, because minus that, we might just be talking about Africa trading with each other, but it will not happen. African countries, we tend not to trade with each other because we even create these problems ourselves. We restricted trade from other countries. Probably it's high time now we started to look at harmonizing standards. What is it that maybe Malawi can push to South Africa with ease? What is it that South Africa can push maybe to other countries, to Kenya, to Tanzania, to any other country with ease? These are the things I think that we need, because it seems like we tend to create barriers to trade ourselves, and as such we end up exporting outside Africa, but we have a very huge potential.
Can we look at some of those areas of concern where we are creating barriers to better and greater regional integrative trade between SADC countries in particular?
Yes, for example, apart from tariffs, trade can be restricted with sanitary and phytosanitary conditions. These are restrictions that probably might come just because you are saying there are certain standards that a country has put that if maybe a good is entering into this country, we need them to meet these standards. Sometimes those standards are just to restrict the inflow of trade from other countries. But if we're talking about trade, we want to grow Africa, we want to trade amongst each other, then I think it's high time we start aligning the product standards. We should ensure mutual recognition of certificates from one country to another to ease movement of goods. We should simplify custom procedures. I remember there was a time when we were complaining about roadblocks in Malawi for goods to move from just Zambia to come into Malawi. You see a lot of roadblocks, a lot of checking in of these goods and trucks. And so that delays even trade. If we want to trade, then I think it's high time we remove even corruption from the roads, from the exports that we are trying to move. So it's high time, I think we need even to understand that labor can also move, services can move. And if we are to move that, then we have to facilitate that movement, bringing in the necessary procedures, the necessary facilities, the necessary infrastructure. We need to invest heavily, to connect each other so that at least we can move the goods. But also we should build regional value chains. There can be another country that has maybe comparative advantage in something. We need to specialize by comparative advantage. It's not like any other country can produce everything and just exporting to maybe the rest of Africa. So by doing that, we can see that countries can focus on what they do best, and then they trade that with others. Some can trade in inputs, some in outputs, but at least there will be trade and everybody can benefit. There will be win-win. But also support industrial clusters. Africa has a lot of potential. We have a lot of SMEs, a lot of goods, but we need products from that. We need SMEs to have manufacturers, within, close by, so that at least we can export across borders. And so we also need to promote agro-processing and also light manufacturing. If you see Africa always export unprocessed goods to these developed countries. But we need this to be happening in Africa. We need to create jobs and stop exporting jobs. So by actually bringing in and also promoting agro-processing and light manufacturing, then I think Africa will be on the right track. And yes, we can be trading with each other. We can process within Africa and move goods across borders. And yes, create a win-win solution for each and every country in Africa.
Then let me just hop on to that thinking of a win-win solution. So critics often say that larger trade agreements mean that it could benefit the stronger economies at the expense of the smaller or less industrialized nations. And looking at SADC, you obviously have inequalities there. How do we strengthen intra-SADC trade with a vision of wider intra-Africa trade without widening those inequalities? What should we be looking out for?
That's where I think we're talking about even agro-processing. If you look at Malawi, we produce tobacco, we produce, tea, we produce maybe sugar and so on, but we don't have a lot of manufacturing. And so I think if we want to benefit into these from these intra-Africa trade, we have also to up our games. We need to be at least at the same level, but then we need heavy investment. That's where now I think we are talking about reforming the global financial architecture, because for countries like Malawi to invest, to match maybe with South Africa, we need heavy investment, but we also need access to finance for that. So it's a high time that, those countries which are less privileged should also have access to finance to build their countries, to build their infrastructure, to build even their industries. And so in that way, then they should be also be able to process within the countries and trade. But if we just open up and say we can actually benefit from intra-continental trade, then I think with that it will not benefit. And yes, it can widen inequalities between countries, because countries like Malawi, which are always importing from maybe South Africa and other countries, they will keep on importing, and at the end of the day, they will not match, the development of the other. So we need to help each other. If we are trying to bring one Africa and we want to grow together, then we should hold hands, try to help the others so that they should not be left behind. And I think that's the whole reason about, African Continental Free Trade Area. We need to trade but also grow together. Thank you.
I want to look at how we can do it from government to government, but from people to people. If we're talking about improving the heterogeneity of cross-continental goods and services, that means there's a certain reliance on communities within the various countries, but communities through sectors across the continent that already have existing networks?
Yes, actually, there is a reliance because if you look at, for example, Malawi and South Africa, you can see that we rely on each other. If we just talk about labor, for example, labor from Malawi, which is transported to South Africa, tend to be a bit cheaper. And that is something that is relying on South Africa, but also we see remittances coming into Malawi. And if we were to allow free movement of labor, when we move, we say sometimes somewhere we might see improvement in the economy of Malawi, because by exporting labor which is not actually being in use in Malawi, but it is in use in South Africa, then I think Malawi will be benefiting by reducing unemployment. However, when we also look at sectors, it's the same thing, because even though we have different countries and there is indeed heterogeneity, but countries can benefit with each other, from each other, by at least starting from within. If we are looking at Malawi and we want to develop, the SMEs within Malawi will grow, will actually manufacture, will actually sell even from the within the domestic market, and the surplus can actually go now outside Malawi across the borders and actually earn something for the country, whether in terms of forex, in terms of revenue, and so on. The same can happen to Africa. However, by moving goods freely, by moving goods across borders, these heterogeneities might actually go on disappearing slowly by slowly, because at the end of the day, we might see that the same things that are moving, we are benefiting from each other. And I think those who are lacking in South Africa might be getting something in Malawi. That's why initially I was talking about comparative advantage. Those who can produce something cheaply, I think those should be allowed to produce. If there is another one which can also produce something cheaply, they should be allowed to produce that thing, and not that one country should actually demonstrate that they can produce everything, because it will not be cheap for them, depending on how countries are built.
The regional blocks, that of SADC, COMESA, EACA, some have pointed at them as being a barrier, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. And what was envisioned in 2015 when the tripartite free trade area agreement was drawn up? And it's obviously nearly a decade later. Do you believe that we're still on track to deliver on that promise? And the developments that have occurred, have they impeded or improved that vision?
So we will say somehow they impede, but also they sometimes facilitate trade. I'll say this in two ways, because there are some benefits that countries have actually seen by just being in these regional blocks. However, those who are not in the blocks tend to be treated otherwise when we're talking about tariffs, when we're talking about maybe there's the issue of most favored nations. There are some protocols that, when you are in a certain regional or trade block, you tend to enjoy certain benefits, and then you agree to treat those who are outside your block the same way. Now, sometimes it happens that those of you who are in the block do not actually produce something that all of you can benefit, but those who can produce that thing that all of you can benefit are outside the block. But because there is this agreement that within the block we will treat each other as brothers, but then outside the block, anyone who is trading with us, we will treat them as this. We end up seeing that some countries tend not to benefit. Maybe they would have imported cheaply from other countries which are not within the block, but just because they are already in the block and they are committed to whatever agreements they signed to, that actually prohibits them to enjoy the benefits of maybe importing cheaply outside their block. However, if you look at maybe trade per se. I will talk mostly about Malawi and South Africa. Malawi trades a lot with South Africa. And we've seen, even when we're talking about labor movements, Malawians go to South Africa without a visa. I think they get a visa upon arrival, a month. They can stay there on visitor's visa. However, that cannot happen maybe with other countries. There are so many benefits that countries within SADC tend to enjoy. When you're talking about even education, there are certain benefits that students within SADC cannot actually pay, certain fees, certain charges. However, others outside SADC tend to pay certain fees. So there are those benefits that I could say countries tend to benefit, but also when you look at certain trade issues, they tend to be a problem because of these the blocks.
Just
Thank you.
A final question briefly. Is there complementarity? And when I spoke about the various agreements that are in place, and you spoke about the challenges in terms of structural and political hurdles earlier on, does the TFTA blend well into the AFCFTA framework, given that that is already in place?
TFTA, could you please clarify TFTA?
The Tripartite Free Trade Area and the AFCFTA framework. Is there complementarity?
I would say they are complementary because it's kind of tapping from the potential of the tripartite free trade area, and it also blend into COMESA, into SADC, into East African Community, and also covers 29 African countries. So yes, it blends very well. I would say that.
Okay, thank you so much for speaking to us, and much appreciated. That is President of the Economics Association of Malawi, Dr. Bertha Bangara-Chikadza. Brings the time to exactly 30 minutes past 9.